This is Christopher Columbus, an ocean no one understood. No accurate maps, no certainty of return. Just open water stretching into the unknown. The ships were small. The crew was afraid. Supplies were limited. Mutiny was close. If they failed, they would disappear without a trace. No rescue. No second attempt. Only the vast Atlantic. And whatever waited beyond it. Section 1. In the late 15th century, Europe stood on the edge of a geographical mystery. Trade with Asia was vital. Spices, silk, and precious goods flowed from the east, but the routes were long, dangerous, and controlled by powerful empires. The Ottoman expansion had tightened its grip over land passages, making traditional trade increasingly difficult and expensive. What Europe needed was a new way forward. Christopher Columbus believed he had the answer. Born in Genoa, a maritime republic, Columbus grew up surrounded by the rhythms of the sea. He was not a nobleman or a trained scientist, but he was deeply immersed in navigation, cartography, and the growing body of geographical theories of his time. He studied maps. He read accounts from earlier travelers, and most importantly, he believed the Earth was smaller than it truly is. That miscalculation would define everything. Columbus proposed a radical idea, to reach Asia not by sailing east, but by crossing the Atlantic Ocean westward. At the time, this was not just ambitious, it was considered reckless. The distance was unknown, the ocean was largely unmapped. Many believed that such a journey would lead ships into endless water, with no landfall and no return. Still, Columbus was convinced. For years, he sought support. Portugal rejected him. Other courts hesitated. The risks were enormous, and the chances of success seemed distant. But in 1492, after persistent effort and negotiation, he secured backing from the Spanish monarchs, Queen Isabella and King Ferdinand. It was a decision that would change the course of history. But this was not a story of certainty or control. It was a gamble against nature itself. The ships were small. The crews were uneasy. The knowledge was incomplete. And the Atlantic Ocean, vast, silent, and unpredictable, offered no guarantees. Columbus was not just sailing toward discovery. He was sailing into the unknown, where ambition, fear, and survival would collide. Section 2. Geography and physical conditions. In 1492, the Atlantic Ocean was not a mapped route. It was a void. To European sailors, yes, it represented distance without definition. There were no reliable charts of what lay beyond the western horizon. Coastlines disappeared into speculation. Entire regions of the ocean were marked not by knowledge but by absence. Columbus and his crew were not just crossing water. They were entering a space where geography itself was uncertain. The journey began from the Canary Islands, the last known outpost before the unknown Atlantic. Beyond this point, there were no ports, no safe harbors, no established routes. Once they left, there was no turning back without facing the same unknown forces in reverse. The ships, Niña, Pinta, and Santa María, were not built for endless ocean travel. They were designed for coastal navigation, where land was never too far away. Their size made them vulnerable. Their storage capacity was limited, as every mile west increased the pressure on supplies, structure, and crew endurance. Distance itself was a threat. Columbus believed Asia was much closer than it actually is. His calculations underestimated the size of the Earth and overestimated the reach of Europe into the Atlantic. In reality, the journey was far longer and far more dangerous than he or anyone on board fully understood. The ocean stretched farther than expected. Day after day, the horizon remained unchanged. No land, no variation, just the constant movement of water and sky. This monotony created psychological strain. Without visible progress, the crew began to question not just the journey, but the man leading it. Navigation depended on primitive tools, a compass, an hourglass, dead reckoning. There was no accurate way to measure longitude. Errors accumulated silently. A small miscalculation could send the ships hundreds of miles off course without anyone realizing it. And beneath the surface, the ocean moved in ways they could not fully see. The Canary Current pulled them southwest. The trade winds pushed them steadily westward. At first, these forces worked in their favor, speeding up the journey. But they also carried a hidden danger. If these winds and currents continued endlessly, how would they ever return? The further they traveled, the more isolated they became, not just physically, but geographically. There was no framework to rely on, no prior expedition to guide them. Every decision was based on limited knowledge and growing uncertainty. The Atlantic was not just wide, it was unknown, unforgiving, and indifferent to human plans. Section 3. Environmental systems. Beyond what Columbus could see, the Atlantic was already in motion. An invisible system of winds and currents controlled everything. The trade winds, steady and persistent, pushed the ships westward day after day. At first, this seemed like a blessing. The sails remained full. The ships moved faster than expected. Progress felt real. But that same force carried a growing fear, because if the wind only moved in one direction, how would they ever return? The crew began to notice it. The wind did not shift. It did not weaken. It was constant, reliable, but also trapping. The further they sailed, the more they felt carried by something they did not control. Below the surface, ocean currents added another layer of uncertainty. The Canary Current had already pulled them south and west from the African coast. Now, deeper into the Atlantic, drifting patterns could alter their path without warning. These movements were slow, almost undetectable, but over time, they could push a ship far from its intended course. Columbus could not see these forces. He could only estimate, and estimation was never enough. Weather added its own unpredictability. While the early stages of the voyage were calm, the Atlantic is never stable for long. Storm systems could form without warning. Winds could shift violently. Waves could rise faster than a ship could respond. A single storm could end everything. The ships were not reinforced for heavy ocean conditions. Their wooden frames creaked under pressure. Their sails strained against sudden gusts. If a mast snapped, or a hull split, there would be no rescue, only water. Inside the ships, another system was failing. Food supplies began to degrade. Salted meat spoiled. Fresh water turned stale. Rations had to be reduced. Hunger was not immediate, but it was inevitable. Every passing day made survival more fragile. Disease spread quietly. Poor nutrition, limited hygiene, and constant stress weakened the crew. There were no doctors, no real treatments. If illness took hold, it would move through the ship unchecked. And then there was the silence. Endless ocean, no land, no change. Just the repetition of wind and waves. This isolation began to affect the mind. Doubt spread, fear grew stronger. Some believed they had already gone too far to survive. Others believed they were already lost. The Atlantic was not just a physical challenge. It was a system of forces, wind, water, weather, and time, working together, indifferent to human ambition. And Columbus was moving deeper into it with every passing day. Section 4. Historical Discovery/Early Exploration. By August of 1492, preparation had turned into commitment. 3 ships stood ready in the Spanish port of Palos, the Niña, the Pinta, and the Santa María. Small, wooden, and vulnerable, they carried not just supplies, but expectation, doubt, and uncertainty. Around 90 men boarded them, many unsure if they would ever see land again. On August 3rd, they departed. The first stage of the journey followed a known path, southward to the Canary Islands. This was familiar territory. Repairs were made, supplies were adjusted. It was the last moment of relative safety before the unknown began. Then, in September, they sailed west. At first, the voyage seemed controlled. The trade winds pushed them forward steadily. The ocean was calm. Progress was faster than expected. Columbus recorded distances carefully, but not always truthfully. To prevent panic, he began underreporting how far they had traveled. Because the truth was becoming dangerous, days turned into weeks. The horizon remained empty. No land, no sign of Asia. The crew grew restless. The ocean, once calm, now felt endless. Confidence began to erode. Signs of land appeared, but never materialized. Floating vegetation, birds flying overhead, shifting currents. Each hint raised hope, then crushed it. The cycle repeated again and again. Expectation turned into frustration, frustration into fear. By early October, tension reached its peak. The crew began to speak openly about turning back. They had sailed farther than any known expedition westward. Supplies were diminishing. The winds showed no sign of changing direction. Some believed they had already crossed into a region from which return was impossible. Columbus faced a breaking point. Accounts suggest that he made a final agreement with his crew. If land was not sighted within a few days, they would turn back. It was a fragile compromise, one that balanced authority against survival. Time was running out. Then, on October 12, 1492, everything changed. A sailor aboard the Pinta spotted land. After weeks of uncertainty, the ships reached an island in the Bahamas, known to its native inhabitants, but completely unknown to European maps. Columbus believed he had reached the outskirts of Asia. In reality, he had arrived in a part of the world entirely unrecognized by his expedition. It was not the destination he imagined. But it was land. The voyage had succeeded in crossing the Atlantic, but it had also revealed something far greater than Columbus intended. Not a shortcut to Asia, but the existence of entire continents between worlds. Yet even in success, the dangers had not ended. Because survival in these unfamiliar lands would bring new risks, ones that the ocean had not yet revealed. Section 5. Real Incidents and Disasters. A 1492, Atlantic Crossing Crisis. The deeper Columbus sailed into the Atlantic, the more fragile control became. Weeks passed with no land in sight. The horizon never changed. The wind continued pushing them forward, but offered no promise of return. What had once felt like progress now felt like entrapment. The crew began to lose trust. They had followed Columbus into unknown waters based on belief. But belief weakens when reality does not respond. Food supplies were shrinking. Fresh water was limited, and the distance already traveled had gone far beyond anything known. Fear turned into anger. Whispers spread across the ships. Some demanded they turn back immediately. Others believed Columbus had misled them entirely. The idea of mutiny was no longer distant. It was forming. Columbus responded with control and deception. He kept two one with the real distance traveled and another with shorter figures shown to the crew. It was a calculated move to reduce panic, but it also revealed how close the situation was to collapse. By October, the pressure reached its peak. The crew demanded a decision: continue or turn back. Columbus negotiated for time, a few more days, one final attempt. It was a narrow window between obedience and rebellion. Had land not appeared when it did, the voyage may have ended not in discovery, but in mutiny, failure, and disappearance into the Atlantic. B. The Santa María shipwreck, 1492. Success did not bring safety. On December 25, 1492, Columbus's flagship, the Santa María, struck a reef off the coast of Hispaniola. It was not during a storm, not during battle, but in the quiet hours of the night, when control was relaxed and vigilance failed. The ship ran aground, wood splintered, the hull became trapped. There was no way to free it. Slowly, the structure that had carried Columbus across the Atlantic began to break apart under the pressure of the sea. The flagship was lost. Without the Santa María, Columbus no longer had enough space to carry all his men back to Spain. The situation forced a critical decision. Some would have to stay behind. Using the remains of the wreck, Columbus ordered the construction of a small settlement on the island. It was named La Navidad. A group of men was left there with supplies, tasked with surviving until Columbus could return. Then he sailed away. The loss of the Santa María was not just a shipwreck. It was a turning point, one that divided the expedition between those returning to Europe and those left behind in an unfamiliar land, with no certainty of survival. See La Navidad settlement collapse, 1493. When Columbus returned the following year, La Navidad was gone. The settlement showed no signs of life. Structures were destroyed, supplies were scattered, and the men left behind were dead. And what had happened was not a mystery for long. Conflicts with local indigenous groups had escalated. The men, left without strict leadership, had reportedly acted recklessly, searching for gold, taking resources, and disrupting local communities. Tensions grew into violence. The result was total destruction. La Navidad became the first European colony in the New World, and the first to collapse completely. It was a harsh reality that survival in these lands required more than arrival. It required adaptation, discipline, and understanding of a world they did not control, none of which had been fully established. Second voyage hardships, 1493 to 1496. Columbus's second voyage was larger, more ambitious, and far more difficult. 17 ships, over 1,000 men. The goal was no longer exploration, but colonization. But the environment did not cooperate. Food supplies ran low quickly. Crops failed in unfamiliar soil. Disease spread through the crowded settlements. Malnutrition weakened both settlers and crew. Expectations of wealth, especially gold, remained largely unmet. Frustration grew. The promise of prosperity turned into struggle for survival. Conflicts erupted among the colonists themselves. Leadership became strained. Control weakened. The Caribbean was not the easy prize many had imagined. It was harsh, unpredictable, and unforgiving to those unprepared for its realities. Third voyage crisis and arrest, 1498 to 1500. By the time of his third voyage, Columbus was no longer just an explorer. He was a governor, and that role brought a different kind of danger. Reports began to emerge of mismanagement, harsh rule. As rising dissatisfaction among settlers, conditions in the colonies deteriorated further. Rebellion began to take shape. The Spanish crown took notice. In 1500, a royal commissioner was sent to investigate. The result was decisive. Christopher Columbus was arrested. He was placed in chains and sent back to Spain, not as a hero but as a man accused of failure in leadership and control. The same ambition that had carried him across the Atlantic had not translated into stable governance. His authority had collapsed. Fourth voyage, storm. Disasters, 1502 to 1504. Columbus's final voyage returned him to the ocean, but this time the Atlantic and Caribbean would show their full force. In 1502, as he sailed near Hispaniola, Columbus recognized the signs of an approaching hurricane. He warned local officials, while advising ships to remain in harbor. The warning was ignored. A fleet departed and was destroyed. Columbus avoided the storm initially, but the journey that followed was relentless. Storms battered his ships, hulls weakened, sails tore. Progress slowed to survival. Eventually, his ships became too damaged to continue. They were stranded on the coast of Jamaica. For over a year, Columbus and his crew remained there, isolated, dependent on limited supplies and uneasy relations with local populations. Rescue did not come quickly. Time stretched, conditions deteriorated. Survival became the only objective. The final voyage did not end in discovery. It ended in endurance, against weather, isolation, and the slow breakdown of everything holding the expedition together. These were not isolated events. They were a pattern. Each voyage, each decision, each step further into the unknown carried consequences, some immediate, some delayed, but all shaped by the same truth. The journey was never under full control. Section 6. Modern Understanding/Present-Day Perspective. Centuries later, the Atlantic Ocean is no longer unknown. Its currents are mapped, its wind systems are studied, satellites track storms before they form. Ships now cross the same waters with steel hulls, advanced navigation systems, and constant communication with the outside world. But the danger has not disappeared. It has only become understood. The same trade winds that carried Columbus still blow across the Atlantic. The same currents still shift beneath the surface. Hurricanes still form with destructive force, capable of overwhelming even modern vessels. Technology has reduced uncertainty, but it has not removed risk. Today, crossing the Atlantic is routine for cargo ships, aircraft, and naval fleets. But history remains embedded in these waters. The routes Columbus unknowingly followed are now recognized as part of a global system, one that connects continents, economies, and people. What was once a gamble is now a pathway, yet Columbus himself is no longer viewed in simple terms. For centuries, he was celebrated as a discoverer, the man who opened the Atlantic world to Europe. But modern understanding has shifted. His voyages marked the beginning of lasting consequences for indigenous populations across the Americas. Contact led to conflict, exploration led to colonization, and survival, for many, became struggle. The story is no longer just about one man crossing an ocean. Yet it is about what followed. Columbus did not reach an empty land. He encountered societies that had existed for generations, complex, structured, and deeply connected to their environment. The arrival of Europeans disrupted that balance, often with devastating results. This perspective changes the meaning of the journey. It transforms it from a singular achievement into a moment of global consequence. And yet, despite all modern knowledge, one element remains unchanged. The ocean still demands respect. Even now, sailors and explorers understand that the Atlantic can turn without warning. Systems can fail. Conditions can shift. And when they do, survival still depends on preparation, awareness, and resilience. The difference is not the ocean. It is what we know about it. Section 7. Final conclusion. Christopher Columbus set out to find a new route. What he found was something far greater and far more complicated. His journey was not just a crossing of distance, but a confrontation with uncertainty. An ocean that offered no guarantees, a world that did not match expectations, and a reality shaped as much by survival as by discovery. The Atlantic did not guide him. It tested him. Every mile carried risk. Every decision carried consequence. The ships were fragile. The knowledge was incomplete. And the forces around him, wind, water, time, remained beyond control. Yet he continued, not because the path was safe, but because turning back meant failure. And that is what defines the journey. Not certainty, not control, but persistence in the face of the unknown. But history does not end at arrival. As the land he reached was already inhabited, the world he entered was already formed, and the impact of his voyages extended far beyond exploration, into conflict, change, and lasting transformation. This is the complexity of discovery. It is never just about finding something new. It is about what happens next. And beneath it all, one truth remains unchanged. The ocean does not belong to those who cross it. It allows passage, briefly, and reminds again and again that nature does not yield to ambition, it only endures.